Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. The system that the Buddha used to explain the human body-mind system is the five khandhas, or in English sometimes called aggregates, meaning that they're built up from components. They're not compact units. These are five in number, one physical and four mental. The physical aggregate is rupa, the body, and it consists of the four elements: earth, air, fire, water. Its physicality, form, that which is solid, that which is material, that which is, in the terms of the human organism, is the body. There's a phrase in the scriptures about the body as being a sack with two openings, originating with mother and father, filled with rice and gruel. That's the human body. The four mental aggregates are Vijnana, Sanya, Vedana, and Sankhara. Vedana is feeling, which is not meant to be feelings as we construe it in English. Is a very broad meaning, equivalent to emotions. It's not that. It's simpler than that. It's the immediate response to stimulus as being pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. So it's pleasure and pain, and it has those three forms: pleasure, pain, and neutral. But there's also matters of degree, obviously. Like something can be painful, it can be mildly irritating, or it can be horribly agonizing, and everything in between. And same with pleasure. Something can be mildly pleasant, or it can be blissfully, ecstatically wonderful, and everything in between. But that's all it is: negative and positive response to stimulus. Vijnana is the faculty of knowing, and knowing not in the sense of understanding, but of experiencing, of being present with. And it operates through the modality of the six senses: eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. And it's intimately associated with the khandha of perception, sanya, which is that which recognizes, perceives, makes sense of the information that comes in from vijnana. It's difficult in practice to separate vijnana and sanya in their operation, but they actually have their quite distinct roles. If you take eye consciousness, chakku vijnana, it only knows color and shape. And then it passes that information on to perception, sanya, which parses that information and recognizes objects, discrete objects like a tree or a house or whatever. The eye does not see that. The eye just sees form and color. And perception perceives these various forms. The last khandha is sankhara, which is mental formations, and it's all the concoctions and constructions of the mind. um, thought, more complex emotions, memories, uh, and such specialized functions as will and intention. All these are sankharas. Now, the Buddha gave this teaching with a specific purpose in mind, which was to provide an understanding of how things work without a reference to a self. And the whole teaching of the five khandhas is meant to be an entry point into voidness or emptiness of self, anatta. This is illustrated in the Anatta Sutta, in which the Buddha talks about the 20 ways in which we construct a self. You take the five aggregates and multiply them by 4, because you can take any one of the aggregates and identify with it in one of 4 ways. So, taking the body as an example, we can conceive, I am the body, or the body belongs to me, my body, myself. Okay? Or we can conceive, I am in the body, or we can conceive, the body is in me. And the same with consciousness and perception, feeling, and mental formations. And all of these are fundamental errors that we fall into either implicitly or explicitly, but we can fall into the error of identifying with the self by identifying with any of these. So the Buddha also made the argument that none of these could be a self, because that which is me, that which is mine, that which belongs to me, I should have control over, should have dominion over, and we do not have dominion over any of these. With the body, you cannot wish, may I be taller, may I be shorter, may I be thinner, may I be fatter. You can't change or modify the body at will in that way. And you also can't will your feelings. May I be happy, may I not be sad. You can't change those things by act of will. So none of these aggregates are really fully under our control, so they cannot be identified as the self. And you search through the aggregates and you don't find anywhere a self, an essence of self. And that's the classic simile or metaphor of Melinda's chariot. In the Questions of King Melinda, who was a Greek educated Bactrian king, was in dialogue with the monk Nagasena. It's quite an interesting text because it's one of the earliest, maybe the earliest, cross-pollination between Greek and Indian thought, East and West. And King Melinda, whose Greek name was actually Menander, he was in dialogue with Nagasena, and it takes a very, although the ideas are entirely Indian, the form often seems very Greek. It has the Socratic question and answer kind of format. And one of the repeated things that Menander says to Nagasena is, give a simile, monk. Nagasena would come up with some simile to explain his point. And then when the dialogue turned to the question of not self, Melinda asks, give a simile, O monk. And Nagasena says, how did you come to this place today? He says, I came in my chariot. He says, Very good, sire. If we took your chariot and broke it apart and put the backboard here and the seat there and one wheel here and one wheel there and the axle over there, could you find in this bunch of parts, could you find me the essence of chariot? And the king says, no, no, there's no such thing. Some more back and forth, and the monk gets the king to define what the term chariot means, and the king says the name chariot is just a designation, a name, a conventional turn of speech to represent this particular set of parts when they're assembled in such and such a way. Then we call it chariot. And the monk says, very good, sire, that's correct. And so it is with the human being. There is just this body, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness. And when they're assembled in such and such a way, we can give them the conventional designation and call them Nagasena or Melinda or whatever. But that has no meaning beyond just a conventional designation. There is no essence of a person. And I've come up with a kind of a modernized expansion to that to illustrate that the idea of a self is a redundant concept. It has no explanatory value. It's merely something we concoct out of nothing. And this is the Melinda's Chevrolet. Melinda is a fellow who has just bought a new car, and he's completely ignorant of auto mechanics. He knows nothing about how a car works. And he meets his friend Nagasena, who is a Class A mechanic. And he says, oh, hey, look at my new car. Isn't it wonderful? And he explains to Nagasena that he's figured out how the car works. So how's that? He says, there's a green goblin that lives under the hood that makes everything go. And Nagasena says, you're nuts. There's no such thing as a green goblin. Well, then what makes the wheels go round? Well, that's the axle turning. Okay, well, the green goblin turns the axle. No, that comes through the gears from the transmission and the crankshaft. Okay, well, the green goblin's in there turning the crankshaft. No, that's driven up and down by the pistons. And, goes on and on through the, every working of the car. And Melinda keeps retreating back to explain it by the green goblin, but you can go through the entire car from top to bottom and explain every working of it, and there's no need for the agency of a green goblin. So the green goblin is like the self in a human being. If a person doesn't understand the nature of body and mind and hasn't examined the workings of body and mind, then it's a kind of a shorthand to say, oh, there's a self. It's a me, a mind that's doing this. That as an agency. But when you examine the workings in detail, you find nowhere a self. You find just the operation of these insubstantial, impersonal, conditional, dependent, impermanent forces of body, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness. Let's look a little closer at these aggregates and contemplate them in this way as being not self. The body can be easily identified by the casual thinker as the self. I am the body is me. In fact, a materialist view allows really for nothing but the body and sees the mind just as a function of body. But we can see, the Buddha's argument that we don't have control over our body, and we can look at that a little closer. There are actually, thousands or millions of processes going on, 1 trillion something cells in the body, and they're all doing their own thing. And it doesn't take any will or effort or even knowledge on our part for all this to happen. As well, there's a host of organisms that are symbiotic with the human being that live in and on the body, in the gut and on the skin and everywhere else. And the body is, of course, conditional, dependent on external conditions to maintain the body, the form of the body. We are passing material constantly through. We eat and excrete. We breathe in, we breathe out. We're constantly changing. The atoms that constitute the body are constantly in exchange with the greater universe. So there's no sense of thinking of it as an independent unit, or even as a real substantiality. It's like you have a stream of water and there's a little whirlpool in the stream. That's a form that persists for some time, but the actual molecules of water are constantly moving in and out of it. It's just a form that persists for some time, but it's not a substance. And so is the body is like a little whirlpool in the universe. It's atoms moving in and out of it all the time. One of the ways in which we misperceive objects, including the body, as substantial, discrete units is called the illusion of compactness. It's a kind of shorthand of the mind that makes a useful sense of the environment, external and internal, because we see discrete objects. We divide the world into discrete objects, and so is with the body. We see, a person as this, four limbs and a head and a trunk, and we call that a person, a body, a discrete unit. And one way of breaking up that illusion of compactness is to contemplate the body as composed of many parts. This is the 32 parts of the body meditation, where you go through the 32 organs of the body, and you're seeing in the body in a new way, three-dimensionally, with internal, with lungs and heart and guts and bones and sinews and blood and pus and all this other stuff composing the body. The aggregate of feeling, Vedana, is the immediate emotive response to stimulus, and it's pleasant or painful, and we don't have control over that. In a dependent origination, it's classed as a resultant factor, meaning that it's a result of conditions. It's not something that we do, it's just something we experience. We don't have a control whatsoever over our feelings. We just react to stimulus as being pleasant or unpleasant. And this is a very primitive level of mentality, of mentation. And you can see how it makes sense for a living organism to have this response to its environment, that even something like a one-celled animal would probably have feeling, in the sense of, this is pleasant, this is unpleasant, and this is neutral. It helps to sort out the external objects. To an organism, pleasant is generally that which the organism can eat, or perhaps in higher organisms also that they can mate with. Unpleasant is that which could eat me or do me harm in some way. And neutral is everything else that can be just ignored. It's neither beneficial or dangerous. So it has this kind of evolutionary function, this reaction. And in terms of our psychology, it's immediate. With every sense impression, there's a immediate sense of this is pleasant, this is unpleasant, this is neutral. This is the first kind of parsing of reality that the mind does. Some details about this that are kind of instructive is from Abhidhamma that only the sense of touch and the mind sense experience are strong enough to induce feeling, pleasant and unpleasant. Sight, taste, and smell and hearing are not. So what this means is that when we see something pleasant and we feel happy, it's not immediately the seeing that causes the happiness. It's then the mind sense that sees that object, that vision, as being something pleasant and feels happy. So, you can see this principle works in our life. I mean, there's a proverbial common saying in English, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. You can see that with people's different reactions to works of art, for example. Somebody finds it very beautiful. Somebody else, oh, that's pretty dull. I don't see what's the big deal about that. So there's not an intrinsic beauty or ugliness in objects, but it's a mental reaction. We see it with food too. There's the idea of an acquired taste. When little children generally don't like anything that isn't sweet. And then as you get older, you start to enjoy sour and salty and bitter flavors as well. And there's things that you maybe didn't enjoy the taste the first time you had it, but then it grew on you. That's because it's not intrinsically in the taste, but in your mental reaction to the taste that the pleasure or otherwise arises. But with the sense of touch is the only one that's strong enough because a touch can be innately pleasant or painful. Like a cool breeze on a hot day is innately pleasant, or a poke in the eye with a sharp stick is innately painful. And it doesn't require, mental processing to decide that. And feelings are important because if we're not conscious of them, there's a whole class of meditation. If one of the satipatthanas is Vedana Sati, is mindfulness of feeling, to be aware of your feelings, because if you're not, then you end up being governed by them, which is the way of a primitive organism. You just dominated by the quest for pleasant sensations and to escape from unpleasant sensations. And this pleasure and pain drives organisms, particularly in this sense-desire realm, and dominates the psychology of the unenlightened beings. Vijnana, talk about vijnana next, is consciousness, that which cognizes, the knowing. And one of the questions that arises is kind of maybe an academic question, but it does come up often, is the relationship between chitta and vijnana. And it's kind of a vexed question. Chitta is the knowing mind, and it's a term that's used in Abhidhamma. It is extremely rare in the suttas and is generally only used as part of a compound, not on its own. But vijnana is what's used in the suttas to refer to consciousness, and it's used generally in one of a very few specific contexts, generally three contexts. One is what we're talking about here is one of the five aggregates, one of the five Khandhas is vijnana, the knowing mind. And another one is the talking about the six vijnanas. The vijnanas related to the six senses. So that's actually a subdivision of the Khandhas. And the other one is in terms of the dependent origination. It's the third nidana in the dependent origination, from ignorance formations, from formations consciousness. And it's explained there as referring to rebirth consciousness, rebirth linking consciousness, the consciousness that arises based on previous karma, arises first in the womb, or in other forms, but a human being in the womb at the initial beginning of a new continuum. Now this becomes a kind of a vexed question because of some parts of the Thai forest tradition uh, talk about, there's a kind of famous or infamous, depending on your point of view, line from one of Ajahn Mun's very few scant remnants of his direct words. One of his is a poem that he wrote, and he talks about the chitta. Poem's all about the chitta, and he talks about the chitta outside the five khandhas, which has caused him to be considered heretical by more textually based Orthodox tradition, like Sri Lankan's tradition won't countenance that. There's nothing outside the five khandha. Others have stated that chitta and vijnana are synonyms. They mean exactly the same thing. So there is a controversy, there's a question around the relationship between chitta and vijnana. In my own understanding, for what it's worth, I tend to regard chitta as consciousness per se, or in its absolute sense, and vijnana is consciousness operating in a specific dependent mode. So it's operating, as we see in the suttas, through the six senses. That's like bound to the form. When we exist in a form like a human form that has six senses, then vijnana operates through those six senses. And this chitta is the ultimate knowing, but it's filtered or through this prism of the organism, through the six senses. And it is an error that it's easy enough to fall into, is seeing consciousness as a self. And I think the main conceptual problem here is the way we tend to think about it, because when we talk about consciousness or chitta or vijnana, it doesn't matter, we're talking English or Pali or Sanskrit or Hebrew or Greek or whatever, we are forced to use a noun to speak about it. And that leads to an unexamined assumption in the mind that there's a thing that we're referring to. And actually there's not. There's no thing that knows. Chitta is not a thing. It's not an object or a substance. It's just the knowing. So it's a verb without a base in a substantive entity. It's the pure knowing. And it's a very useful practice to try and understand the nature of chitta. Because if you're centered in the chitta, then there's no conflict in the mind. There's no difficulty. There's no stress or pushing and pulling, because the chitta being so absolutely pristine and simple and uncomplicated, unburdened with anything. It can know everything, but it's not affected by anything. So the chitta is just simply experience. It can know happiness or sadness, but it's neither happy nor sad. And it's always, to begin with, seems like such a difficult esoteric subject to try and know the nature of the knowing mind. And that's not because it's so complicated, but because it isn't. It's because it's so absolutely simple. Our mind wants to make things complicated so we can understand them. We can put them in some kind of a logical sequence or an algorithm, but the chitta is not susceptible to that. It just knows. That's all it does. Perception or sanya is, as I said, is very difficult in practice to separate it from vijnana because the two operate so closely together. It's how we experience the world is through a combination of vijnana and sanya. And sanya has characteristic of being somewhat creative and also educable. It can change with time. Example of it being educable, let's say someone has studied university or elsewhere, they've studied botany and they know all about plants, and they look at a field full of, you know, plants, then they perceive that in a whole different way than someone who's never taken any interest in botany at all, doesn't know the first thing, he just sees a field full of weedy looking plants, and that, you know, his perception in that area is not nearly as refined. Perception has a creative aspect, which is actually very important and is a profound statement about our reality as we experience it. First, as a easily understandable example of the creative aspect of perception, sanya, I think everybody's done this at some point in their life, just watching the clouds in the sky with a relaxed mind and just taking in the shapes, and you begin to see faces and animals and, you know, all kinds of things in the clouds. The perception can actually become quite detailed and realistic looking, and that's perception playing. You know, it's taking the stimulus of the senses and creating forms. You know? And that's actually what it's doing all the time to some degree. In our ordinary waking life, perception is constrained by the input of the senses. That's the raw material, which is actually quite limited. We get these signals from the outside world. A narrow bandwidth of light uh, constitutes what is available to eye consciousness. A narrow bandwidth of vibrations in the air is what's available to ear consciousness. You know, and certain molecules are stimulating to nose and tongue consciousness. So we're only getting these signals, these limited fragments of reality that impact on our senses. And perception then takes those signals and creates a world out of it. So this is important to understand that the world we actually live in and experience and deal with is a creation of our own minds. Our mind creates a simulation of the external world based on sense input. And if our senses are good, normal, and we're sane, we're not crazy, then our perception of the world will be a reasonably accurate simulation, certainly accurate enough to be able to function in it. And it'll be similar, if not, closely identical to the simulation other people experience. So we can mutually discuss and share, and we will have the sense that we're living in the same world. The question of what the external world actually is a moot point. At least in Theravada Buddhism, the Buddha discouraged going into that kind of metaphysics because it's open to endless speculation and the answers can't be really had. There seems to be throughout Buddhist history there were different approaches, and Theravada Buddhism seems to generally take the view that yeah, there is an external world, but you can't really know the details of it. So all you got is this your mental image. So don't get too fussed about the external world. It's not really a useful point of inquiry. Whereas there were later schools of Buddhism that held there is no external world. It's all just a concoction of the mind. It's the Yogacara school. But that doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. What matters is that we understand that the world as we actually experience it is our perception of the world. Another way you can see this, how this functions, is with some optical illusions. There's lots of clever optical illusions, and there's one whole class of optical illusions where the mind fills in blanks. The picture actually has gaps in it, but unless you stare directly at some point, you'll see the gap. But everything else, like you see a grid, and it looks like a perfect grid, but there's actually gaps. And if you look at one point, you'll see there's a gap. But in the rest of the picture, it looks like the grid's all filled in. Because your mind is filling it in. It's not actually there. And we do that all the time. Another example of that is with sound. There's a really amusing phenomena that I've heard it called mondegreens, where you hear a song and you get the lyrics wrong somehow, and that sticks with you. And every time you hear that. And it's called mondegreen because a classic example is there's a Scottish ballad that says, one of the lines says, they killed the Earl of Moray and laid him on the green. And somebody heard that as, they killed the Earl of Moray and the Lady Mondegreen. And every time you hear that song, you hear that. And I heard this thing on the radio once talking about mondegreens, and the funniest one was somebody who said that for years she thought that it was, all we are saying is give Jesus pants. And so that's your perception, and it actually sounds like that. It actually sounds like the Lady Mondegreen. You hear that because your perception is filling it in. And we do that kind of thing, all the time. When we're dreaming at night, perception is off the leash. It's not constrained by sense input, so it's just making stuff up out of fragments of memory or imagination. But it's still the same process, but it's not constrained by the senses. So there's no way we can identify with perception as a self because it's obviously so fluid and ultimately unreliable. It's just the way the mind works. Sankharas, or mental formations, is a category that includes thought, volition, many other factors. In the Abhidhamma, there's a list of 50 sankharas, and that may not even be a completely exhaustive list. There is in Sarvastivadana and other Abhidhammas, there are various different lists that don't quite match with the Theravada list, but there's some attempt to analyze and break down this category of sankharas. The word sankhara means that which is built or constructed, and the mind obviously, builds, constructs, fabricates things. There's an old joke that says the neurotic is someone who builds castles in the sky, and the psychotic lives in them, and the psychiatrist collects the rent. The mind can create all kinds of things, and none of it is substantial. None of it has any persistence or any reality. Sankharas is a place where we can easily get caught. And it's, I think, a common unexamined flaw is to identify with the mental formations, or to confuse the mental formations with consciousness, or to see the mental formations as self, or as real, or as important, substantial. That's a very important insight when you can perceive the emptiness, the impermanence, conditional, unsubstantial nature of mental formations. So you're not taking them so seriously. You're not giving them a validity that they don't actually have. Obviously, sankhara has a functional aspect. If it's understood and properly disciplined, we can use mental formations, and we do use them all the time for practical, beneficial purposes. You have to think out a problem. You have to, you're trying to figure out what's wrong. You've got a broken machine. You're trying to figure out what's wrong. You're using mental formations to troubleshoot the machinery. Or you're making a schedule, or doing anything else. You're using mental formations. So that's their functional aspect, but it's also the endless piling on of mental formations can become quite burdensome. And this is something that is experienced commonly by meditators, is this the phenomenon they call monkey mind, is the mind jumping from point to point and just not settling, and being full of this idea, that idea, something seems really important and amazing, and you got to figure it out and follow it, and then you jump to something else, and then there's a bunch of nonsense, and the mind just constantly concocting stuff. And it's, I think, a very common human experience. And it's something that is very valuable, is when you can experience the stillness of mind and the quiescence of the formations. I think most people initially don't even have an inkling of what that would be. There's a strong tendency to identify the thought with the self, the being. I am the thought. This is Descartes' I think therefore I am. It's a strong identification with the thinking process, where it's actually just one function of many in the mind, and it's dependent, conditional. That's why they're called sankharas. They're constructions. They're built up, dependently arisen, ultimately coming from sense experience, and then the mind concocts things around it. And this can be seen in meditation. If there's a good exercise to do in meditation sometimes is to, and this only works when the mind is generally quiet, but if you have some train of thought that you missed initially arising, but you're thinking about something, and then you mindfulness kicks back in, you say, oh, where did I go off the rails there? If you can then trace back retrospectively, okay, this led to that, this led to that, you'll often find that the initial disturbance to the tranquility of the mind was some sense experience, a sensation in the body or a sound or something will then trigger a thought formation. That's a very common way that the mind then generates these sankharas. And they tend to be self-replicating. Once you start on that train of sankharas, they building and building and building on endlessly on themselves. If you can get quiescent enough in meditation, it is possible to notice the volition or the intention to think before the thought arises, and that's a very interesting state. If you can get to that point, the mind is completely quiet without thought process happening, but every now and again there'll be a sort of a bubbling in the mind, and you can see it starting to gel towards a thought. It doesn't yet have any content. It's not a thought about anything, but just an intention, a movement towards thought. And if that's clearly seen, it can be cut off at that point and the thought never arises. So these five aggregates are what constitutes a human being and no else besides. There's no self. There's no green goblin under the hood. Each one of these aggregates is empty, dependently arisen, impermanent, empty of self-substance, not existing from its own side, dependent on causes and conditions, insubstantial. The Buddha gave a set of metaphors to illustrate the emptiness of the sankharas. He said the body is like sea foam, like froth on the waves. Feelings are like soap bubbles. Consciousness is like a conjuring trick. Perception is like a mirage in the desert. And sankharas are like a plantain tree trunk. Now that one I never understood till one day in Thailand I saw a plantain tree cut down. And I understood. Plantain tree looks from the outside. It's kind of like it looks like it's sort of like a palm tree, And it looks from the outside, it looks like a very solid trunk, just like a regular tree trunk. But when it's cut down, you can see the structure of the trunk is actually completely hollow, and it's built up of what looks like sort of big blades of grass that coil around each other. That makes the trunk. So there's no actually solid trunk. So it's like sankharas that are just built up. They look very solid and real, but they're just completely insubstantial, just built up of fragmentary bits. So these are the five aggregates and the composing of the human body and mind. And the purpose of understanding this is to give a useful entry point into understanding the idea of voidness or anatta, not self.